Hello, yes, thanks for that introduction and delighted to be here today. I've never done a hybrid conference before. I'm very excited by that. It's great to think there's people out there in the world watching this. Um, yeah, I'm here today to talk about one aspect of the archaeology of Clyde Wind Farm. It's interesting that we're talking about sort of recent developments in archaeology in Scotland. This is the best part of 20 years worth of work. And that's culminated in the production of a multi-chapter monograph, which came out through SARE at the end of 2023. The project as a whole was a huge undertaking physically on the ground, and then in presenting the results of what became something of a kind of large landscape study, given the geographical spread of both the site and the archaeological discoveries that we made over the project. And I would encourage you to go and look at the SARE publication to read the full results. So Clyde Wind Farm occupies the best part of about 50 square kilometres. It spans both sides of the upper reaches of the Clyde Valley. Does the spot work? Yeah. This sort of green blob here gives you an indication. It occupies a really big area. The scale of the development can, to some extent, be best seen if you're ever on a sort of road or rail trip south from the Central Belt. A little north of Abington, the turbines start to kind of spring up on the left-hand side, the eastern side of the Clyde River. And then as you travel south, you start to see turbines on both sides. And that keeps going for about 10, 15 minutes while you're driving at tens of miles an hour. It's a really, really large site. In terms of the construction history and just the background to it, there's a couple of interesting and sort of slightly innovative practices that were involved. The first was that as part of the environmental impact assessment process, the setting of cultural heritage sites was assessed as part of that. And this project was in part key to developing aspects of the process of that and the methodologies. And then also when permission was granted for construction to proceed, in the conditions relating to archaeology, there was specific mention of the need for there to be a named archaeological clerk of works on site during construction full time. And this was one of the first projects of this type to have this position embedded in the archaeological conditions. And the ACOW formed part of the environmental management team on site, quite a sort of senior involvement in the management team. And we ended up having a ACOW presence on site pretty much, well, more than one ACOW in many cases, pretty much constantly between 2009 to 2015. The results of the work can broadly be divided up into sort of 4 landscape units. Those around Wood End, which is up here, on the lower slopes immediately overlooking the Clyde as it travels north towards Lanark. Features in the Camps Valley here and the Midlock Valley here, both of which are 2 tributaries of the Clyde converging at Crawford just about here. And then there was a small single site down here at Newton Plantation, again, just immediately overlooking the Clyde. And the wealth of information and sites that we found over the course of the project is really extensive. We've got partial excavation of an Iron Age hill fort, discovery of various roundhouse structures. We've got some early medieval industrial activity, and we also had the opportunity to excavate a fairly substantial slice through a previously recorded unenclosed platform settlement in the Midlock Valley. However, the area that I'm going to concentrate on is the Camps Valley. I think it's a really interesting sort of case study about demonstrating the value and potential of these kind of projects in these specific environments and the sort of archaeology that you're getting that can really advance our knowledge. So the Camps Valley, it's fairly typical valley in this part of the country. Whoops, back. You've got the Camps water running east-west. It's been dammed at its eastern end here with the Camps Reservoir and joins the Clyde about 3 kilometres downstream. It's interesting to note, so as I said, it runs east-west, but there's this quite noticeable bend and then it travels south, and it makes, when you're in the Camps Valley, it feels really cut off from the Clyde Valley as a whole. The Clyde Valley is obviously quite wide and certainly seems to act as a route that people can travel up and down, but the Camps water feels quite different from that. It's bordered to the north and south by sort of very smooth, rounded, but really quite steep hills, and the Camps water sort of meanders across the valley floor. In terms of known sites, before we started doing any work, the biggest or most important probably is Normangill Henge, which sits on the valley floor here and is a really visible monument in that landscape. There's a series of burial cairns running along, these, Mossy Dod and Normangill Rig. As is typical for this part of Clydesdale, you have unenclosed platform settlements on the lower slopes of the hills surrounding. And that's particularly at the eastern end, at the head of the valley. The Camps Valley formed a sort of dividing line between two sections of the wind farm, and it was the main route for a connecting access track, which is this orange line coming down here, and then also for two lots of cable routes, which brought all the all the energy, I suppose, from the northern section of the wind farm up, from all the turbines in the north down to the Midlock Valley, which lies to the south of Camps Valley. And the access track alone resulted in a continuous strip, usually somewhere between 10 to 20 metres, usually about 20 metres to be honest, all the way from the ridge line in the south, right down the hill, right down to the valley floor, and then all the way back up again. So it's this really wide, extensive slice. And then that was repeated by two successive cable routes, which were usually somewhere between 2 metres and 10 metres, immediately next to it, so sort of a few tens of metres away. And that in total resulted in an area of about 10.6 hectares being monitored by archaeologists. And on the one hand, 10.6 hectares is a hell of a lot of, area to see and archaeology to potentially discover. So it's a really big slice, but also if you look at it in comparison to, it's a tiny line in comparison to the whole of the valley, which I'll come back to. This view just also gives a wee bit of an appreciation of that sort of valley topography. The road and valley floor sit around 270 metres AOD. The ridges at the valley edges are about 450. To some extent, this photo in my head doesn't do justice to it because I think this looks quite open and rolling hills, and actually it feels really narrow with the valley sides rising up really steeply on either side, and certainly when you had to walk up them when there was no access tracks, they felt very steep. So the archaeology found across the valley comprised a total of 48 individual features, the vast majority of which are single pits. On first glance, they're really similar. They're all about 1 metre wide. They're incredibly shallow. I think the best preserved example we had was about 30 centimetres, but most are somewhere between 5 and 15 centimetres deep. The fills were also fairly uniformly similar. They're somewhat stony. They're charcoal rich. There's varying degrees for in situ burning, not a massive amount, and some contained artifacts. But generally, on first glance, they're relatively undiagnostic. But with no additional evidence, it was certainly when we were on site, we're like, oh, this is the same thing happening. It's a single phase of activity, or it's the same thing happening across a very large landscape. Where it gets more interesting is with the radiocarbon dating. So of the total 48 features, 21 were dated, and pretty much everything we could date, we did. And that revealed that these seemingly identical pits actually represents activity spanning around 5,000 years. So earliest ones are kind of round about 7,000 at the earliest, and running down to about 2,200 BC. So before we move on to looking at distribution and those sort of date ranges, just to look at the what I'm talking about, the shallow nature of these, and without being critical of the archaeology, relatively uninteresting. Let's see a few in all their glory. So that's one under excavation. That's another one half sectioned. That's what they looked like beforehand. These are not fantastically preserved remains, and I'm not really going to be focusing on individual pits beyond that. So the first activity we have evidence for is in the Mesolithic. We've got 3 pits, one around 425 metres elevation up here, and then one here about 325 and one about 300 on the south side. They all contained hazel charcoal along with some fragments of molloidite and birch. There's no finds from any of them. And broadly speaking, they're dating to be between about 7,000 and 6,000 BC. And I think this really illustrates why, what I'll come on to about shifting our head about what this kind of means, because to all intents and purposes, from visually, this pit here and this pit here looked really similar, and they ended up having really similar dates. And so you're like, oh, it's the same thing. That's 2 kilometers apart. It's a massive distance. I mean, yes, you probably could see those 2 locations from each other across the valley, but they're not actually related. It's just the same thing happening in 2 different locations. For the early Neolithic, the next sort of group we've got is about 8 individual features. We've got a group of 4 kind of in round here, 4 individual pits across 3 locations on the south side, all at heights between about 280 and 320 metres. And they generally had hazel charcoal coming from the fills. I think one had some charred hazelnut shell, and you can see there's some fragments of carinated bowl, you know, of typical date coming from a couple of those pits. I mean, this is small fragments of pottery, they're not massive amounts. If we move on to the Middle Neolithic, there's a total of 10 features spread across 5 locations. And this period is probably where you get the most consistent spread and density. You know, it's at all heights, it's right down to the valley floor, it's right up at the top, and it's on the north and south side of the valley. It feels like things are ramping up and this is the busiest kind of period. You've got a pit down here on the about 380 metres. You've then got about 100 metres further down the hill, a collection of 4 incredibly truncated, probably talking about less than 5 centimetre steps, pits. 2 of those are ones that did show evidence of in situ burning. Not very many examples had that. And charcoal from that group was a mix of hazel, alder, and smolloidite. A short distance away, just to the northeast, was a single pit, which also contained some blackthorn charcoal, which was the only example that we had from the site, again with some carinated bowl, some lithics. On the north side here, you've got a couple of pits which contain some impressed ware, and then a single pit up here at about 390 metres. And then onto the late Neolithic. That's at 5 locations, solely on the south side of the valley. There's 2 sort of locations up here on this sort of flattish bit of mossy dod at about 380 metres elevation. And there's some interesting aspects to the deposition that's going on with those pits. There's a couple of pits right next to each other where there's fragments of the same vessel that has ended up in 2 pits. Is that deliberate? Is it deliberate deposition, or is it just that stuff has ended up in there because they're next to each other? One of those pits contained 2 2 early to middle Neolithic scrapers and a middle Neolithic arrowhead that you can see up here. So this is stuff that's probably from 1,000 years before, and it's ending up in these pits. Is that deliberate? Is it not? The archaeological features during this period also were the only ones which showed a sort of move away from that solely pit feature kind of activity. Again, on Mossy Dod, a large charcoal spread proved to be a couple of pits, but surrounded by this little sort of wind break structure. So it looks like there's something a little bit structural going on. And then further tantalising evidence of a possible structure in the form of a pit or a hollow with some post holes surrounding it, again, possibly a windbreak or something like that, some sort of shelter. So both these groups of features could suggest that you've got a partial move towards construction of some sort of temporary structures, or that we're seeing evidence of temporary structures, whereas if they were there in the past, we aren't getting any evidence of that. The dating here, once you get into this late Neolithic, it becomes more problematic. We had grooved ware from this cluster here, and our feeling is that that's reasonably secure, but there was also a radiocarbon date from about 1,000 years before that, again from the Middle Neolithic, found in association with this. But there is another pit that's dated to the Middle Neolithic that's less than 10 meters away. So there's stuff sort of washing around to some extent. And as we get into this period, it becomes more and more difficult to be certain about how secure that material is. So there's also a single later late Iron Age pit, and there's some medieval ditches as well, but I'm just focusing on these pits. In summary, we've got, a few dozen pits of near identical typology and morphology, but are potentially separated by hundreds, if not thousands, of years. And how do we make any sense of that? They can't really be considered to be a group or collection, even where one's been identified in some sort of proximity to another. You're probably still talking about tens of meters away. And on any other site, it'd be a really hard sell to kind of match those things together. But because we started to look at the distribution, I mean, the dots on the map that I'm talking about, that's more, it's an illustrative process so that we can say there's one here, there's one here, there's one here. But that starts to make you think, oh, they're associated, and they aren't necessarily. It'd be hard to think of such a disparate and disconnected distribution of features as related. And added to that is the fact that the features are all incredibly shallow. The presumption is that they're all truncated to some extent, but we don't really know whether what we're seeing is just the base of a much larger feature, or actually they were always relatively shallow, probably not as shallow as we're seeing, but still relatively shallow features. The peat sequences, so they're all covered in peat, the topsoil was peat rather than topsoil. And there's nothing in the peat sequences that can tell us what was going on with that question. So pits of Neolithic date containing that mix of lithics, pottery, charcoal are not necessarily uncommon on a variety of sites. In fact, on a great many sites that I've excavated, it'd be quite common to have a few scattered pits around the place which have this mix of material, and then they later prove whether it's through dating or because of the material that's in there to be Neolithic in date. There's some suggestions that this seemingly consistent mix of pottery, stone tools, debitage, burnt material, but without the presence of in situ burning, points to the idea that this is rubbish being thrown away and buried in the ground. And then there's varying associated views on whether that represents just simple tidying up of areas people are living in, keeping your area clean kind of thing, or whether there's something ritualistic to that behaviour, with a degree of ceremony being attached to this process of burying waste. Why are we getting little bits of stuff going into these holes? Personally, I struggle to see the logic and justification for the idea of societies digging holes to bury rubbish, which are as small as this. If it's purely to keep an area that you're living in clear of debris, they seem small in terms of the amounts of debris. There's only ever partial fragments of pots and stuff like that. And it's an awful lot of effort than just dumping debris a suitable distance away from where your camp is. The reality is, however, as I said, these specific examples are far too shallow to have useful data to advance that specific question of what's going on in terms of the deposition, and whether that's mundane or something more sacred. What does seem clear is that they represent an activity that was consistently happening over many hundreds, if not thousands of years. So what reasons might there be for a continuous, if sporadic, focus of particular activity in the Camps Valley? In looking at Neolithic pits of this type across Scotland, there are sites which have significant ceremonial structures, such as henges, timber circles, the kind of thing that would be very visible, where there's pits of this typology, morphology, and with similar assemblages, which have been interpreted as the evidence of the first hints of those type of activities, and then that later coalesces into the construction of more permanent monuments. So sites like Balfarg, Blair, in Fife, Malden Bridge, and Peebleshire, that kind of thing. We believe Normangill Henge, this is a very dark image, I should have lightened it up, but Normangill Henge you can just about see down here in our sort of artist's impression. It was likely constructed around about 3000 BC, and that would have formed an incredibly visible focus for on the valley floor. And this is also the period around which we have that sort of apparent ramping up of the pit digging, largest density of activity going on. Could that be connected? This sort of suggests a landscape which in the late Neolithic, you've got ritual activities, processions, that kind of thing happening, very much focused on the henge at the valley floor. But with any number of what I'm calling family groups, that's potentially a controversial thing to say, but groups of people camping on the hillsides overlooking it. They're coming to this space for some reason and for activities in relation to the henge. That henge might have formed the sort of structural zenith to an activity which gathered people in the Camps Valley through the generations. And as I say, certainly that cut off, isolated, special, contained feel that the valley has in comparison to the Midlock Valley does seem to set it apart. In many ways, it's frustrating that we can't really develop our understanding of the individual pits any further because of their shallow nature. But it's also important to highlight how valuable this body of evidence is in understanding what I think is non-settlement activity in the early prehistoric. And for me, there's two key implications. First is the elevation that these features were being found at. So when monitoring started on the wind farm, through discussions, it was proved that it was incredibly unlikely that you're really going to get anything above about 400 meters, from sites in the surrounding area where you think human activity is going to be concentrated. There are recorded cairns on the hilltops, but that's all stuff that's already known and sort of visible. Thank you. And then when we started doing the monitoring, we're starting to get pits at 400 meters, 425 meters, much higher than we were expecting, and that threw that assumption out the window. And so we actually increased the height level that we were monitoring to when we were doing the extension construction. And I think we need to look closer at specific topography. All these features are turning up in little sheltered spots, and it doesn't really matter how high up they are. The second is the sheer number of pits. So I had 10.6 hectares of ground monitored, and we've got 48 individual discoveries. If you take that as a sample and you do some, not statistics, but some very simple maths and sort of think about that area, about 1.5 kilometers long, you could have something like 1,800 individual features in that sort of space. And then you multiply it by however long the valley floor is. Yes, they're all of different dates, but you're still going to have, you separate that out, you've still got hundreds in the early Neolithics, hundreds in the middle Neolithic, late Neolithic. And that suddenly takes something that feels like an empty landscape, these people watching these machines, you're finding one pit every 200 meters or something. It doesn't feel like it's a densely occupied kind of area, but actually there's a hell of a lot going on there. Yes, it's individual activities. And I think developments such as wind farms like this give a really good opportunity where you're seeing access routes coming right from the ridges all the way down to the valley floor. And we need to kind of look at this kind of material more. It's a huge opportunity. Finally, I just wanted to thank all the staff that worked on the project over the years. It was quite wet and snowy, and standing at 400 meters above sea level is not a pleasant experience. Also to the ACOWs who, took the job really seriously. The efforts that they made to understand the landscape when they were on site really made a difference to what we understood by the end of it. There's a couple of them here. And also thank you to SSE Renewables who funded the work over the last 2 decades. And as I said, I would encourage you all to go and look at SARE 104, where the whole thing is published. Thank you.